Welcome. We're glad you're here. My name is Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. We are so glad you could join us to hear Dr. Taylor share his work about how horses shaped human history. First, a little background. This talk is part of the library's One Book, One Valley community read. Every year, we celebrate community and literacy by bringing folks together around a single book. This year's book, as you may know, is The Ride of Her Life by Elizabeth Letts, which chronicles the journey of Annie Wilkins, who crossed the US from Maine to California on horseback between 1954 and 1956. Throughout January, we've been holding programming around the book, and today's talk on the human-horse relationship down through the ages fits right into that theme. Our series will culminate in a visit from Elizabeth Letts herself, who will be holding 2 talks at the library on January 31st and February 1st. All right, so now I'd like to introduce tonight's honored guest. Dr. William Taylor is an assistant professor and curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado Boulder, whose work explores the domestication of the horse and the ancient relationships between people and animals. With active field research in projects in horse country around the world, from the steppes of Eurasia to the Great Plains of North America and the Pampas of Argentina, his work brings together emerging technologies and cutting-edge scientific techniques alongside historic records, traditional knowledge, and personal experience to help tell the story of people and horses. A National Geographic explorer and Fulbright scholar, Dr. Taylor received his PhD with distinction from the University of New Mexico, where his research into ancient Mongolian horse cultures also received the Popejoy Award, the university's top prize for dissertation research. His scholarship has been published in top-tier scientific journals, including Science and PNAS, and has been funded by international granting agencies from National Geographic to the National Science Foundation. His research was awarded the 2023 Newcomb Cleveland Prize from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Please welcome Dr. William Taylor.
Flip my switch here. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Sound check, video check, pulse check.
Share screen.
Minding my glasses here, sorry. Otherwise I'm not going to see you frown when I say something dumb. I even have a clicker.
Or you
wow.
can arrow. Whatever is for you.
Hey, all right. Okay, well, the lights have dimmed, so I better begin. Start off by thanking Eric and the library here for inviting me. My sort of hidden secret is that I absolutely love Estes. I live in Longmont, and my partner works for the park, and pretty much anytime I have the excuse to come up here, usually just because I really want the cherry pie that you can get on the road, but also happens to be the location of my favorite bookstore in the world, who was McDonald Bookshop, kind enough to make an appearance here. But in general, I just really, this is a great community, and it's such a beautiful library and a beautiful place to be on Monday night. So thank you all for coming out in the snowy weather. Not quite as snowy as it was a little bit ago, to hear me talk about horses. And I will also say that, it's a tremendous honor looking at this list of folks to be lumped in with such a cool sort of month-long set of programming. So not every library has such an engaged, leadership and programming, people trying to build community, share ideas, and bring in folks from other parts of the world. So I think you all probably know that's pretty lucky, and thank you, Eric, for doing that. So, all right. So we're here to talk about horses and how they shaped human history. At least that's the promise on the book cover, if it's to be believed. Before we do that, I'll just maybe a little bit less flowery personal introduction. So I'm Will. I'm the curator at the CU Museum, which if you ever drop through Boulder, in typical circumstances, right there on Broadway at the top of the hill, in between frat houses and people, walking from the bar or whatever. Currently, you have to peer through some construction fencing to find us, but we are open, free to the public, and believe it or not, within a few weeks, hopefully, you never quite know, we'll have like a new exhibit about horses and the human story. Also, kind of trying to be global, big picture and focus, kind of like this, but lots of cool objects as well, right? So if you don't take it from me verbally, come look at the cool objects. But around the world, from Estes Park here to the steppes of Mongolia, perhaps no other human-animal relationship has quite shaped the world that we live in now and the world that's come before us quite like the domestication of the horse. And normally I prepare a little spiel here to kind of like anchor this for people who maybe, riding their bikes or skateboarding or driving around. But I don't have to here because just this weekend, some of you all were doing this, right? Which is one of the weirder things I've seen people spend a weekend doing on horse, but also pretty cool, pretty adventurous, and illustrates that even today in 2025, right, horses are really kind of part of the bread and butter of a lot of parts of the world, here included, right? So trying to understand the relationship that people have with horses, where it began, how it shaped our world and where it's headed in the future. It's a kind of an interestingly personal task for me, for a specific reason. And that is, I grew up in Montana. I am the grandson of a Montana cowboy. He unfortunately didn't make it into the 21st century here. My grandpa Park was born in 1903. So, there's only so much we can do. But my dad was raised on a ranch. We're not the landed gentry, so basically he got a job, became a lawyer, and I grew up as generation one of this like cowboy culture, but no horses, right? And so in my house growing up, and the more I tell this story, the more I see there's a lot of folks all across Colorado, the American West that have a similar story where they're part of the horse culture. They might wear cowboy hats, to, fancy events and whatever, but they don't have the horse relationship anymore. And it's a recent change, right? So for me, growing up and trying to understand myself, my family, my place in the world, I was kind of living in the shadow of this guy. And it wasn't just the shadow, but there was a lot of material things around, right? Everything from, the tacky cowboy art on the wall to the one thing I've got in my own living room now is this horrific brass horse lamp, like a rearing, you all know what I'm talking about. But, some of the things that I inherited from my grandfather include his horse equipment, right? So I had, at one point, my folks handed me this giant sort of box of, actually one of those old, like, 19th century luggage thing with the big clips, and this, big stickers on the side. And inside of it, everything from harnesses to bridles to chaps to boots, lariats, what have you, the works. And I say this just because I'm going to return to this after an evening of thinking about the material remains of horse culture and what stories they tell, because I think my career that grew out of this background brought me into a world that kind of looking at it a little differently at the end of the story. And that career is, I became an archaeologist, right? And initially, my very first experience doing archaeology for real as a student was actually in the steppes of Mongolia. So I spent a summer, filling up coffee and stapling papers for folks at the Smithsonian in DC. The next summer, they invited me to join them on a project in Mongolia. The very first thing I got to do was excavate a 2,500-year-old horse burial, right? And not just the horse, but like the equipment, so gold-covered horse bridle equipment. But at the same time, I was also, perhaps the most transformative piece of this was I got to spend that summer working alongside young Mongolian archaeologists who were part of a living horse culture, right? In a way that was new to me, and started my own connection and relationship with riding horses, with talking about horses, with spending time around them, right? And since that time, my job as an archaeologist has allowed me to do things studying the past relationship with people and horses all over the world. Sometimes things that look more like the, Indiana Jones sort of thing, riding horses up a mountainside or digging, holes in with dramatic backgrounds. Sometimes though, looking more like museum work, looking through dusty old boxes, or spending time in the laboratory trying to, extract ancient DNA, sequence a genome, analyze isotopes, making 3D models, and almost everything in between, right? So through doing so, kind of gotten a uniquely material-oriented focus on how do people's relationship with horses begin, and what can we learn about it. And that's the information, that's the premise behind Hoof Beats, and I'm going to try to give you a bird's eye view of what some of those important moments in the story, which I cheekily call a beat, right? Look like, but encourage you to check it out and dive into the pages, or if you're even so inclined, the bibliography afterwards in detail. What can I tell you about the origins of the human horse story? Well, maybe I'm being a bit of a completist, but in my view, the true origins of this relationship actually begin, believe it or not, with like the asteroid that drove the dinosaurs extinct 66 million years ago, right? This event we call the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, if you want to be really wordy about it, but almost everybody would see and recognize as, big asteroid, dead dinosaur, this sort of thing. This was a really important event in Earth's history for a lot of reasons. And everyone here in this room, we sort of owe our existence in many ways to this event, because what it did is it shook up the balance of global ecology in this incredible way. And mammals and birds and a few other, sort of clades of animals managed to kind of find their way through this very dark and difficult time period, right? And in that period, after the dinos sort of vacated all this ecological space, we went from a common history as kind of ground-dwelling little critters who all sort of did roughly the same thing, which was not very much, and radiated into the tremendous variety of animals that are on the landscape today. So back 66 million years ago, the ancestor of us, right, early primates, and the ancestor of a horse, not really looking necessarily all that different, right? And as we talk about the early evolution of horses, this was a long process, right? 60 plus million years. The first horses weren't particularly horsey, right? Depending on how far back you go, these animals that we might call a dawn horse or some of their later relatives, and this one here is Mesohippus, they look pretty different. Some of them might have been the size of a little dog or eventually like a little deer. Not a single hoof here, right? But initially 4 and then 3 toes, and not particularly grass oriented, right? We're kind of browsing around the edges of forests. So Earth was a very different place, right? But over the millions of years, Earth's climate changed, and especially grasses about 25, 30 million years ago really took off, right? And we actually got the first special grassland environments, the first prairies, right? And horses were kind of lockstep in sequence, with that emergence of grasslands. And some ancestral horses figured out specialized ways to eat grass, right? Grass is pretty tough stuff. if you've ever eaten a blade of grass, I can unfortunately say that I have done that. You find it's difficult to digest. It's basically little bits of like silica, cellulose, right? It's also a tough place to be to avoid predators, right? Horses obviously evolved to be very, very fast in order to avoid predators, but they also they evolved other things that are in many ways more important. Obviously, we like horses because they're big and strong and fast, but horses evolved complex social behavior that allowed them to kind of cooperate, right? When a big scary wolf or a cheetah or that sort of thing appears. They evolved complex communication systems, right? In the domestic animals we have today, horses are almost without parallel, with the sole exception being maybe the dog, in their ability to directly communicate with people through, gestures, sounds, facial recognition, these sort of things. And part of that has its roots here in evolving these social systems to navigate life on the emergent prairies, right? So, as you found out if you attended trivia night, the animals that we today recognize as horses and their closest relatives, right? The genus Equus, but this is horses, it's donkeys, it's zebras, it's the wild asses of Asia and formerly Africa. And these animals have their origin story within the last 2 to 4 million years. And they evolved actually for the first time in the grasslands of North America, which at various points over the last few million years, right, have been isolated or connected to different parts of the world. So not just, I'm not going to wander off from the podium, I almost did it right there. Not just through like land bridges to South America and Panama and that sort of thing, but the Bering Straits today, the Bering Sea, depending on what's going on with global sea level, has at various times been connected to Eurasia by a land bridge and separated from Eurasia by sheets of ice, right? And so this kind of separate and interconnected sort of cycles really define the last 3 million years, a period we call the Pleistocene, which gave us our first humans, and it gave us our first sort of ancestral horses that are animals that we would recognize as members of the genus alive today. So, at moments of connectivity, those ancient horses spread out of the grasslands of North America where they evolved, and they radiated into the rest of the world, right? Everywhere, major land masses except, places like Australia, Antarctica. And they diversified into a number of different animals, right? The zebra, the wild asses, and adapting to some different environments, right? So in particular, horses and the animals that are most closely related to the horses we have today, kind of they maintained a connection to the kind of colder grasslands, right? But 3 million years ago, we had some of those environments even in places like, Southern Europe, North Africa, lower latitudes in Asia too, right? So around this time, early hominins kind of emerging in Africa and also making use of points of connectivity to curiously spread into different parts of the world. Not just the animals we recognize today as Homo sapiens, right? But earlier ancestors too. And early hominins like Homo erectus, right? Moving out of Africa and in different parts of the world where they would now for the first time begin to encounter horses in a meaningful way. So 1.8 million years ago is the first co-occurrence of early hominins and horses in the same deposit. And we don't quite have the smoking gun to say at 1.8 million years ago they were definitely hunting them, but they were probably eating them at least, right? And we don't, lots of people like to fight about early human, were they scavenging, were they hunting? Hard to prove things one way or the other. What's not very hard to prove is that very, very early on, those early pre-Homo sapiens hominins were hunting horses. And we know this from sites like the site of Schöningen in Germany. Apologies for my German pronunciation, never quite did get that, panned out, even though I lived there for a little while, in which horse bones are actually found alongside wooden spears. Believe it or not, fossilized wooden spears. These are humanity's oldest weapons. They're at, almost 500,000 years old, and they are found smack in the center of a huge pile of horse bones. And those horses were clearly regularly hunted at the shores of a lake, right? And not just this site, but other sites like the site of Boxgrove in the UK show that these early hominins knew strategies for hunting horses and hunting them well. They would, have you ever tried chasing a horse through the prairie? Doesn't go real well, right? So it requires coordination, thinking. They would ambush horses by a water source where they were known to go, but where they, couldn't really get away. And these waterside hunting grounds became a strategy for hunting horses. They also, would pick migration corridors, right? And hunt them in whole groups, right? So you could get a whole band of horses, like the skeletal remains recovered at Schöningen, right? But it wasn't just hunting, and it's hard for us to say. The deeper we go back in time, the harder it is to say exactly what was happening in ancient societies. But what's clear is we really for a long time have underestimated, the complexity and sophistication of early hominins. One of the things we do know about horses is already at this time, 500,000 years ago or more, horse bones were being used to make tools. Now, most of those tools probably being part of the stone tool improvement process, right? So, things that you call like a soft hammer for making or sharpening your stone tool. We see a lot of these different skeletal elements. But some of them look more like they were used for scraping, right? Perhaps processing a soft organic material. And it raises a lot of questions about, what other products from horses might have been used by early hominins and how might they have been used, right? And I think this is an exciting area of scholarship that we're learning more and more, year after year. As we started to get early modern humans, so by 40, 50,000 years ago, much of Eurasia was now populated by a new kid on the block, fresh out of Africa, right? And engaging in some really complicated social behaviors, art, right? Religion, complex cooperation, communication, all of the things, a lot of the things that we view as unique to modern humans really take us back 40,000 years or more here. And somebody went to the trouble of summarizing all of the cave art known from Eurasia. Now, of course, the author was French, so most of the known art is from France, but also including other places, North Africa, right, Russia, some of the areas where we have, large sort of artistic assemblages of what was going on. And tallying them all up, horses by far and away the number one most depicted animal, right? And not just because they are tasty, although we know that that's part of the process, because they're also the number one animal in terms of numerical appearance in what we call archaeozoological assemblages, piles of bone found at places that ancient folks were living. But I took this picture myself, and I can tell you from getting to where this picture was painted that there was more going on there, right? This is a trek, about a 45-minute trek into the bowels of the earth to get to the cave where this was painted. And almost certainly the artistic representations of ancient horses, and they're not just paintings, but also carvings of various things. These are the things that survived, right, through tens of thousands of years. They really indicate a role for horses in, ancient spirituality, religion, and belief in a way that it's harder for us to pin down, but was very clearly an important component, right? So this is a long time ago, right? And basically, over almost all of the last 40,000 years, horses have been hunted by folks. They've been represented artistically. They've clearly been a core part of human culture. The question on a lot of people's mind when they want to know about horses is, how did we go from this, right, or maybe more like this, to this, right? A very, very unique, almost, exclusively unique in the animal kingdom, that a prey animal as evasive and honed by evolution to get away from danger as the horse now allows us to hop on its back and doodle around, or as was the case this weekend, slap on a pair of skis and doodle around, right? This is an extraordinary change of events, and one that has had an incredible effect on the way we communicate, the way we travel, our agriculture, our military, our power, and all of these sort of things. So this is the core question that kind of has animated my scientific scholarship. It's a difficult one to ask, because the further we go back in time, the fewer historic records we have, the fewer artistic depictions we have, the less direct insight or clues we have into something as elusive as a behavioral interaction between human and horse. But we do have a very emerging and interesting and exciting field, which you might call scientific archaeozoology. This is a growing set over the last 30 years of a toolkit, a multidisciplinary toolkit that allows us to look at what did survive, through the millennia, and to make inferences about something as invisible as a relationship, right? A domestication. So this means things like osteology. It means things like you could see with your eye, like the bones. It means things you might not be able to see with your eye, but are still sort of encased within ancient animal remains, like ancient DNA, right? Stable isotopes. And we'll talk a little bit about these, but they're kind of stitched into the answers that I'm giving you. For me, my personal focus and biggest interest is this one here, animal paleopathology. Looking at changes, not just health problems, but just changes in the bone that reflect the habitual activity patterns of both people and horses, right? So you might not know it from me standing up here, but an osteologist could look at my bones and see that I sit and write a lot of emails, right? Or that I'm right-handed, right? Or potentially that I had a nasty football injury in college, right? So this same principle actually can be applied creatively to understanding the animal remains from ancient assemblages. And something like a horse, which is often carrying, human body weight, being controlled with equipment, big pieces of metal in its mouth, a saddle on its back. Each of these things accumulates over time and gives us a toolkit such that we can actually, we know this by studying modern and ancient comparative assemblages from museums all over the world, we can identify something like riding a horse versus pulling a chariot its whole life in the patterning of problems in, or even not just problems, but just subtle little changes in the structure of the bone itself, right? Or we can recover the configuration of the equipment, the bridle configuration that was used to ride a horse, just based on how the mechanics of that work in the mouth and how those things accumulate over time, right? So by looking at this stuff, we've gone from just kind of a shooting in the dark to honing in on some basic sense of when horses were domesticated and how that stuff sort of transferred across the ancient world. Now, if you know something about horse domestication, you've read a few books on the topic, you probably know the main model, which up until recently was very, very heavily entrenched in scientific scholarship and public consciousness. Things like David Anthony's Horse the Wheel of Language, Horse the Wheel and Language. You might hear it called the Kurgan hypothesis, right? And sometimes the Yamnaya model. And basically the idea here is that, especially derived from when we didn't have these exact indicators of human activity to build from, but we're just kind of looking at the archaeological record and eyeballing it, right? There's a lot of things that archaeologists have always been interested in: the steppes of Eurasia, right? This is the, big open grasslands, and it's where places like the Mongol Empire would emerge. It's where historical sources point us to, domestic horse cultures from a very early age. And at the edges of the Eurasian steppes, there are some interesting changes in the late 4th millennium BC. You see things like new interesting ceramic styles, right? Or the kurgans that it's named for are these big burial mounds, right? That's what that word refers to. And the record shows that all of a sudden these things kind of spread out from Eastern Europe into different parts of the continent. So they spread into central Germany. The Nazis really liked this idea because it was like, hey, early horse domestication. But not just the Nazis, lots of regular scientists like the idea too. Um, Evidence links this migration a pretty long ways away, right? We have evidence for the Yamnaya folks moving to like the Altai of Russia, right in the middle of the continent. So really some interesting things going on. And these patterns look new, they look exciting, they look could, things like moving long distances seem like they could reasonably be associated with horse domestication. And there were other things too, right? Folks would look at the archaeological record and say, hey, all of a sudden we've got these funny new artifacts. We don't quite know what they are. Maybe these are early bridal equipment, right? These are ideas that were current not super long ago. But the more that we've learned about how to trace this stuff and applied it to this Yamnaya idea, the less it really holds up in court. And one example here is our little bridal equipment. A few years ago, my colleagues here found this in situ in a burial, but that burial is not of a horse. It's actually of a cow, right? And turns out these are actually lip rings for early oxen that were used to pull carts, right? So there's a lot of stories like this. A famous site called Derievka, which looked like it had early horse paleopathology until they accidentally radiocarbon dated it, and then whoops, it was several thousand years younger than they had thought it was, right? One by one, basically, the Yamnaya idea is kind of eroded a little bit, and attention focused a little more on another site, which you may have heard of in northern Kazakhstan, right, called Botai. And just jumping back here to our little diagram, if you look carefully at a lot of diagrams of horse domestication, you can actually see the thought process of folks as they try to adapt this model. In this case, there's a little bloop sort of drawn out from the core Yamnaya area to cover Botai, right? Because it's kind of like, well, this didn't work. How about that? Now we got you, right? And the site of Botai is interesting because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horse bones. There's almost nothing except horse bones at this site, which sounds really impressive and exciting, except when we think back to the Paleolithic and realize that same could be said of, dozens and dozens of these 20, 30, 40,000-year-old archaeological sites where folks were just hunting horses at that spot, right? All the way back to Schöningen, right? 100% horse bones, but nobody's saying, hey, early, Homo heidelbergensis is domesticated the horse. But there's some other evidence at Botai that's a little more intriguing. First of which is what appeared to be, on first glance, changes to the teeth of the horse that we have found similar things in ancient and modern horses used for riding that you'll sometimes hear called bit wear, right? Basically, this is the idea that the enamel of a horse is hard, but metal is harder. And when you're yanking a bit around in the mouth, that stuff can come into contact and kind of erode the front surface of the tooth, right? That's the idea. And this is a real phenomenon that happens, especially in more historic assemblages. Also at the time, circa 2009, as early biomolecular tools were improving and folks were able to kind of trace other aspects that were previously invisible, looking at ceramic potsherds suggested that, hey, there's some fats preserved on these potsherds, and if we kind of compare around what are the comparative databases here, looks like these fats, they're definitely horse. Maybe not a big surprise, 100% horse bones, but they look like they might be milk, right? So this is when you hear early horse milk, this is kind of what this is referring to. This somewhat rudimentary approach to trying to trace milk using biomolecular techniques, cutting edge at the time. But there were always problems as well with the bow tie idea. And from the beginning, one of the biggest critics of the bow tie idea, a gal named Marcia Levine, was pointing out, hey, when you manage a herd of horses, you have to make real specific choices about which animals to kill and which ones not, right? You can't just willy-nilly, kill the biggest and tastiest, because you need the herd to reproduce every year, right? So if you kill especially breeding age females, you're gonna have a very short trajectory as a horse herder, right? Because you run out of horses the next year. And unfortunately, Botai is, about 50-50 male and female horses. And the female horses, sometimes they even killed pregnant mares, right? Not a really great plan if you're herding horses. And really, the profile of age and sex of animals really lines up nicely with what we see from hunting assemblages. The other thing that they always struggled with is the fact that a lot of these horses were literally stabbed to death with harpoons, right? Which, some of these were embedded in the ribs, as you can see there in that diagram. So again, a pretty hard to argue that some of these were not at least hunted, right? But as our biomolecular toolkit has improved, it's given us a lot more insight, right? So things like when the dentist makes you sit down and really start scratching away with a little, pick, what they're doing is removing calculus, right? This kind of mineralized crust on your teeth that actually is preserving a lot of information to what you were eating. And, so ancient folks that weren't so lucky as to have that scraped away, we can actually identify the proteins from milk that were preserved in those in slices over time, right? So in this region of kind of the Black Sea region, north of the Caucasus, you can see what kind of milk folks were having. And turns out that horses didn't show up until, the first millennium BC here in terms of the milk people were drinking, right? Before that, it was mostly sheep and then some other things, but definitely not horse, right? The most devastating blow to the whole picture, though, was this, which is that as we started to have DNA sequencing of the horses themselves, it turns out, whoops, they were not actually closely related at all to the animals that became horses today. In fact, they were a different taxon entirely, which still exists today that we know as Equus Przewalski or Przewalski, right? These are basically the cave painting looking horses that you see on the landscape today. They almost went extinct in the 20th century, but have been reintroduced. Now, so the DNA folks, initially tried to bend this towards, wow, this means we also tried and failed to domesticate the Przewalski's horse, right? But there's an alternative explanation for these patterns, which is that Botai, in fact, has very little to do with the domestication of horses at all. And one little insight into this came from recently. These animals are kind of rare on the landscape today, but New York Times had an interesting article a few months ago. They happened to turn up at some livestock auctions in Utah, and this old, this kind of mid-30s Utah cowboy was kind of interviewed about his experience trying to break and ride one. And I liked his quote at the bottom. He said, "It was wild and mean and disrespectful." So, these are more like trying to ride a zebra than ride a horse. Behaviorally, right? I told you how important behavior was, but not all equids are equal in terms of their behavior, right? And I think that first domestication event probably had a lot, to do with the behavioral traits of the horses that did become domestic. Once we found out this, we started taking a second closer look at that Botai data, and this is what we found. A lot of these problems that we're seeing in these ancient horses, not actually related to mouthpiece equipment at all, but in fact are natural defects that we can see on wild horses from the American Pleistocene era, right? Things like little nutritional enamel hypoplasia, variation in the banding of cementum, and this sort of thing. And so we have to be careful when we're looking at what is related to transport and what is a natural problem, and perhaps this gave folks, the sort of the wrong idea. So this leaves us still lingering on the question, where and when were horses domesticated? And in order to answer this, I think we, sort of counterintuitively, we have to step back and look at what was going on in West Asia over the last few thousand years. And believe it or not, the story of horse domestication starts, at least based on the science that we have today, starts with other animals. And the first one of those animals used for transport was not the horse, but it was actually probably the cattle, right? We saw this already in our little lip ring vignette. But cattle were used for transport pretty early in the story. Might have been 4000 BC, might have even been a little bit earlier, in which they started to pull sledges. And we know this from actually early historic records that start to document what was going on with animal transport in places like Mesopotamia. So they were pulling sledges agriculturally. Pretty soon those sledges turned into wheels. And lo and behold, it was a matter of moments from an archaeologist's perspective that we went from having something with wheels pulled useful for agricultural labor into a tool that folks used to kill each other, right? And so these early things turned into what scholars often call battle carts, and they began to plug and play other animals into this new technological system. And believe it or not, the first equid to be using these also wasn't the horse. So around 3000 BC, donkeys also entered the agricultural labor game in the Nile Valley. They spread into Mesopotamia, and pretty soon, donkey battle carts, right? And but donkeys, you're laughing because it's not the most menacing animal of all time, right? You can imagine these kind of slow speed battle carts. But they knew that, and they started to crossbreed donkeys with other faster animals. And so the second animal to be used in equid transport, also not the horse. This is a site from a site called al Mara, and it's actually a 4-animal burial, which genomic analysis shows are all first-generation hybrids between a donkey and an Asian wild ass, which is less behaviorally, sort of tractable, but it's faster. Right? This was an early innovation. Let's make these things go faster. And we can even see our little lip ring situation here in terms of eroding the whole front surface of these, ancient teeth here through that lip ring banging around in there. So not banging around on the interior premolars, banging around on the front of the animal's mouth, long before the first mouthpiece was invented. So this is the context in which horses were domesticated. A broader regional trend in which multiple animals were kind of being plugged and played. These new technologies were emerging, kind of Flintstone cars, right? And this is just across the Caucasus Mountains here from where, ultimately we would find our first domestic horses. And the new scientific record aligns the findings from things like radiocarbon dating, animal genomics, actually align with old school, tried and true, boring archaeological context, right? And so we actually see that the very, very first evidence for horse domestication is kind of what folks thought it might have been in the early 20th century in some ways, where horses are found in burials just north of the Black Sea and into Russia's like Ural Mountain region. Towards the very end of the 3rd millennium BC, they're found in burials with chariots. Right? 2 horses, a chariot, and a person. And not just with chariots, with the first bridle equipment. The very first thing that goes in an animal's mouth in all of human history is right here at the dawn of horse domestication. And it's, you can kind of see a reconstruction of it by my Russian colleague over here on the left. This is important. This is a new level of control, right? And you can understand why you might have needed more technological advantage when you think about how fast and strong and imposing. Nobody's laughing when you say horse battle carts, right? These are a fast and dangerous animal. And these kind of Flintstone cars that would have been pulled even by our hybrid equids here, they've got these thick disc wheels, 4 animals here, kind of a slow tank type situation. But these horses would have been fast, and they needed new innovations to control them, including also the invention of the spoked wheel, which emerges alongside this called the Sintashta culture around the same time, right at around 2000 BC. And this aligns with what we see in the archaeogenomic record. So if you trace our lineages of domestic animals alive today, all the way back to their very first appearance of a lineage that looks like their ancestor, we find basically they all appear all at once right around 2000 BC. And before that, almost all of Eurasia had a different lineage of ancestors, right? And probably we have our origin point here in the area north of the Black Sea, just not at 3000 BC, but instead at 2, right? Not with the Yamnaya, not with the Kurgans, but a little bit later in the journey. So why does this matter if it's all pointing us to the same spot? It matters for a couple of reasons. And one of those is that this means if horses were first domesticated at 2000 BC or just before, this means that their spread across the ancient world was not some gradual fun phenomenon that we can slowly plot out. It was a lightning strike, right? And within 500 years, horses radiated out from that core domestic zone all across the continent and into other continents, right? Europe, Asia, Northeast Africa. And this radiation, in some cases, was fun, right? If you're living in the steppes, this meant horses were starting to influence, hey, you could be a little more mobile. You could herd animals in a more, mobile way. You can integrate more animals into your lifestyle, that sort of thing. If you were in, though, the settled agricultural civilizations of the ancient world, it wasn't very fun, right? And we find that civilizations across the world, from ancient Egypt, who were toppled by the Hyksos out of the Eastern Mediterranean in 1700-ish BC, to ancient China, also including places like the Indus Valley, ancient Greece. All of these places were totally uprooted in a handful of centuries by folks who had control over horses. And in this case, it was primarily chariots, right? The chariot-drawn transport seems to have been the origin of military use of horses in Eurasia, right? So this stuff rewired the ancient world in a fundamental way. All of a sudden, it wasn't like who had the coolest, sort of most imposing religion, or who had the most control over the grain stores that was controlling power in the ancient world. It was, could you access horses, right? And, how were you? And so places like ancient China, the Shang dynasty, the origins of states in China that modern China will trace their first riding, this sort of thing. The first king got the first horses and chariots, and he was recording as luxurious hunts and having a really nice time. These Shang burials include chariots, and it's kind of like a fun elite situation. The Zhou dynasty, as you can see from this image, from a burial from the Zhou dynasty, they figured out the numbers game, and they were closer to the steppes. They were able to pull together a large chariot army and absolutely devastated the Shang and ended the Shang dynasty, right? 1100 BC, all of a sudden, boom. The geopolitics of China are very, very different, right? So the final stage in our journey here is to go from early horse domestication, kind of a lightning strike across the ancient world, but at this time, folks didn't exactly have the same kind of control over how they were getting around that they do today, right? And we can see this in some of the depictions from the second millennium BC. One of the earliest depictions of folks actually riding on horseback comes from ancient Egypt. This is the temple of Ramses the Great in Luxor, which, by the way, if you could ever have like a free weekend, cool thing to do, very cool. It's a giant panel, and I showed it there, of giant chariot battle, hundreds of chariots battling each other, right? But if you look closely with a magnifying glass, you can see a few sad little horse riders around here, right? And they're mostly riding naked. This one's little head got cut off here, but you can see basically a naked person, sometimes holding a message, once in a great while holding some kind of a weapon, but basically they were probably scouts and messengers. High, speed at all costs, not bringing these things into battle. Clearly folks were riding horses, but indicating something about how they could be controlled in more stressful circumstances, right? And the first depiction we have of mounted cavalry is very illustrative as well. This comes from Assyria at around 900 BC, and it shows, again, some hidden secrets if we look a little bit closely. We can see that the first cavalry in terms of horses being used in controlled mounted combat is actually a team sport, right? You have one person holding the reins and another one doing the shooting, right? And they're kind of stacked on top of each other, so it's a little hard to see, but there's little secret buddies here for each of these cavalry folks. and showing you that there was an element of lack of control going on in this early horse, transport. The chariot probably giving us a little more stable situation. There's two animals a little further away. You're not on the back of the animal being like, yeah, I gotcha. And there's also technological changes that were needed to kind of help make this happen. One of the biggest here is the metal bit, and in particular this jointed metal bit, which today we would recognize as like a snaffle bit, ability to communicate more nuance, more directly, more immediacy in control compared to these very simple bits, which were either a straight bar or oftentimes in the steps, it was just like a piece of leather or rope, right? Really simple stuff. And obviously, in a high stakes combat environment, that extra level of control playing an important role. So having horse riding also, perhaps in a less lightning strike way, but gradually started to rewire the steps in a very, very important way, centering political power. Basically each horse now was a potential military unit, right? And each individual person could travel as long distance as they could go on horseback, right? So for the first time, ancient Eurasia in particular started to be not just some interesting, floodplain civilizations on one side or the other, but actually centered in the steppes. And these steppes emerging as actual empires, not just marginal places, but center places, with giant cities built solely for the purpose of managing the Khan's sort of wealth and attendance and all the incredible sort of folks that would come from every corner of the world to sort of meet at this administrative capital of what is today still, basically empty prairie, right? And we might associate this thing with something like the Mongol Empire, right? Actually, the earliest of these predates the Mongol Empire by millennia. And this is one of my favorite artifacts that kind of shows that story. This is, believe it or not, a silver medallion depicting, probably from the Roman era, but depicting the Greek hero Hercules, right? Engaged in some sort of unspeakable act here. But this was excavated from an elite tomb in central Mongolia and dated to the second or first millennium BC. And speaking to this as a place where you would find Roman glass, Persian carpets, Chinese jades, and not just artifacts, but people too. Human genomics showing cosmopolitan convergence of people and populations and groups, right? These steppe groups would also start to innovate in the way we control and use horses, moving from something like a simple saddle pad to, this was our discovery the other year, this is the world's oldest frame saddle. And it came out of where? Western Mongolia at around 300 CE, right? So here's an example of, and the saddle and the stirrup kind of being a paired invention that we now take for granted in many ways as a part of communicating on horseback. So horses spread all around the world, and they did so in fits and starts in some ways. Obviously, for the most part, horses can't swim, no submarine horses. And so some of these developments were early, horses moving to the British Isles, Scandinavia, Japan, across small oceanic distances. Horses had to cross other geographic barriers too, like the Sahara Desert, right, which is a tough place to journey, not a lot of water. But the expansion of the Islamic Empire and other animals like camel helped make horses join the grasslands of sub-Saharan Africa, right? Which became, home to giant empires that really rival some of the Eurasian empires too in the last 1,000 years. Horses eventually, right, with open ocean voyaging technology, spread to essentially every major landmass in the world, including, for a very sad couple of weeks, Antarctica with the Shackleton expedition, right, in 1906 or so. There's somewhere in Antarctica, there's some frozen horses that didn't make it super far. And eventually they shifted, right, their plan to dogs, right? But spreading around the world, leading to incredible horse cultures in places like the Great Plains of North America, where our own science here shows that they pretty much, just like we saw in Eurasia, spread like lightning, right? From their first arrival in continental, Mexico, probably reaching places like Colorado, the Southwest, the Northern Rockies within a few decades, and not through the grand arrival of, the Spanish army, but through trade, through indigenous networks of trade, movement, and exchange up the backbone of the Rockies to places like the Missouri River, Idaho, Wyoming, all by the early 1600s, right? Horses also, perhaps less knowingly, that horses spread into places in the Australasia and the Pacific, giving us some, perhaps a little bit less unfiltered relationship between folks like Aboriginal Australians, but also, poke around the South Pacific, you'll find great horse cultures with indigenous folks in places like New Zealand. Hawaii has one of the most, established cowboy cultures that you'll find today, and all happening, within the last 200 years or so. So when we look around the world today, we see one in which horses shaped every corner of the globe in really shocking and striking ways, sometimes like a lightning strike, really elevating people of horse country, especially of the steppes, right? Not just, the Eurasian steppes, but also the great grasslands of the Great Plains, the Pampas of Argentina, and making these places center places, right? Places people would go, places where there was trade and connection and movement, and political power, right? The establishment of things like Comancheria, right, or the Lakota, geopolitical dominance in many ways for a long time. Eventually, right, industrial mechanization kind of ended up replacing and ruling the day here. But initially, industrialization didn't minimize the importance of the horse. In many ways, it sort of escalated it for a time, right? So as we had things like the railroad, all of a sudden horses had to carry, connect the dots between what existed and this new important infrastructure, right? As you had big, heavy equipment, most of it initially was built on was pulled by horses. We had mining using pit ponies, right? All of our big draft breeds that we have today, they're all only a few hundred years old, and they all sort of relate to this period in which there's actually increasing mechanical demands on horses for the labor of our industrializing world. One of my favorite anecdotes in the book is there was even a horse-powered ferry system going on in this like horses on a hamster wheel situation in the going on for a while, right? But ultimately we ended up with a combustion engine, personal vehicles. The world wars in many ways made these things more available in places like Colorado, the Western U.S., and ultimately, when horses were no longer needed from that personal transport day-to-day role for a lot of folks, it did result in some drastic kind of roundup, slaughter. This is your glue factory days, of the early and mid 20th century, in which the number of horses on the landscape from a wild perspective, from a domestic perspective, changed drastically. But it didn't change the same way everywhere. And when we think about our world today, there are many places in the world where I spend my time, I know where some of you spend your time, in which the role of horses is not all that different from how it used to be. There are corners of Mongolia where I ride horses 2 or 3 weeks every year, not because I necessarily want to, but because it's the best way to get around, right? And I know as we look at a changing world, there are folks that are trying to restore some aspects of the horse that went beyond simply their getting from point A to point B that have been missing in our rapidly kind of industrial whiplash world. This includes Native folks restoring the role of horses in youth programs, right, and ceremony. It includes the role of horses in sport. It includes the role of horses in things like equine therapy, right? Folks recognizing that that individual connection between rider and horse actually has medicinal, psychological value, right? And, there are some roles of the horse that have pretty much never changed. And if you're ever unruly in downtown Albuquerque on a weekend night, you might find out that one of those is power, right? And the police will come out on horseback for their raw crowd control, or go down to downtown London, right, and see the Queen's Horse Guards, and you see that some of these symbolic things are just the same today as they ever were. So as we look at a world that is, rapidly changing, this is in downtown Mongolia, Yeah, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Um, it's clear that while the horse is probably not going to necessarily return to being our, workplace commute every day, that there are certainly some very interesting and important roles for horses in the world um, that lies ahead. And I like to close by just thinking again, returning. I said I'd do this. Return to Grandpa's horse equipment, right? And look and think about what stories and information and connection actually remain in this dusty old box. So when I first looked at it, this was like, wow, this is cool old stuff, but it kind of stopped there. Now when I look at the things that my grandfather used, basically one human lifetime ago, I can see this incredible global horse story encoded in material form. I can see his spurs, which, carrying a kind of a Spanish style invented in Europe in the first millennium BC. I can see the bridle that takes the basic configuration and design, taking us back to Sintashta and the very, very first domestic horses, right? I can see styles and configurations. I can see the saddle and the stirrup, which bring me to Mongolia in 300 CE on the other side of the world where I spend most of my time. I can see Spanish influences that turns out are actually Islamic Arabian in their first appearance in the archaeological record. And almost everywhere you look, you can find a thread to link you to some other part of the world and some other people that have connected with horses in an equally significant way that shaped their own life and their own story, right? So think about those things the next time you're looking at your own little horse junk in your house. And I think it tells us an incredible story, about the past, about the present, and about the future. So with that, happy to take your questions, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, so we'll start questions here in 1 second. Let me turn some lights up and stop sharing the screen. And all right, so let's see. I'm gonna do my best to alternate between our in-person audience and our online audience. Online folks, feel free to submit your questions through the chat, and in-person folks, to help out our online folks, if you could just wait for me to get to you with the mic before you start your question, that would be a big help. All right, who's got a question?
I'm thinking about the diagram where you showed that bones for horses that were ridden versus bones for the chariot pullers had different densities. I think I'm remembering correctly that the horses that had riders, the legs had stronger bones.
I'm trying to fiddle with this to see if I can pull it back up, but we may.
He's turned the projector off.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah.
And then you just said a couple of minutes ago that the draft horses were a relative recent breeding program. But I'm wondering, those chariot horses, was there any, as they had descendants, those bone configurations, did they follow through to the foals, or was that just specific to the individual horses?
This is a great question. What this diagram is showing is actually the concentration of pathological problems related to like work, weight or stress or pressure. So basically what it's showing is that, you get more problems in the front limbs, the neck, the shoulder for these chariot horses, and none in kind of the mid back, right? And then with the riding horses, fewer of those first kinds, and then a lot of problems right under, the butt of the rider. But your question is a good one, which is, what adaptations or specialized traits were folks looking for with horses in these chariot horses, how did that pass on to future generations? We know a little bit about that. Some of the ways that we know about that. So these ancient horses were small, right? So they were not, and they were strong. There was definitely a strong emphasis on stamina. They're a good corollary would be like an animal that gets today called a Mongolian pony. Um, I think it's pony, maybe not the correct word. That's the ancestral size and shape of the horse, right? And they have very, very good at high stamina activity. But from the genomes, we can also see, there were a few other things that were being selected. Stamina is one, but the other being like stability of the back, right? So you envision those first horses, one of the reasons probably that folks didn't spend a lot of time on their back is that it was bad, right? They had less strength in their back, right? How much of that, passed on through the morphology? So far, we haven't seen, a whole lot of evidence that these things were encoded at the this wasn't like a breed specific thing. You needed really, thicker bones or something like that. No evidence of that sort of thing. But clearly, once people started riding horses, they began to breed or select them at least for some different traits. And one of those most obvious one is height. So the first millennium BC is where you really see cavalry and a lot of these more significant riding. And it's also where horses go from stumpy to taller, right? And some of that might have been through castration, but some of it was clearly breeding for taller horses that were a little bit better in kind of that mounted combat. So those are some of the changes offhand that I know about. There's probably a lot more that we don't know about in detail because they require kinds of research that hasn't been done, like an internal scan of some of these bones over time and whether something like density might have changed. I mean, so far I just don't think that work has really been done. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm not the boss. I'm like,
Just a quick clarification question from one of our online audience members. Did you say the earliest horse prototypes roamed the grasslands of North America, but then disappeared from North America, and then were brought back by European colonists, and then their use spread among indigenous communities here?
yeah, so I didn't actually go into that super great detail, but I do much more in Hoof Beats. But yeah, that's essentially correct, is that, even though horses evolved in the prairies of North America, my intuition, we don't totally know all the dynamics of it, but my intuition is that those ancestral horses were a lot more cold adapted than some of the ones that really, some of the different lineages out there in the rest of the world, right? Obviously, many of them survived into the modern era, not just the horse, but like the zebra, the wild asses, right? Some of them are developed for different environments, the donkey being really great in deserts, for example, right? So as the last 10, 15,000 years brought an end to the last ice age, a period we call the Holocene, right? It's warmed up pretty seriously. And the kind of space for cold steppe megafauna has sort of shrunk over those last 10 or 15,000 years, all over the world, including, right, some obvious examples like the mammoth, right? But the more we look into this, the less it is just like a extinction and more of shifting distributions, right? So we're now finding from data sets in the high Arctic of places like Siberia that at 5,000 years ago, you still had some populations of mammoth. You had species of horse that no longer existed that were kind of cold adapted, right? And you probably had the same thing going on here in North America. The last persistence of those ancestral North American horses that we know scientifically comes from like the high Yukon in these kind of frozen sediments where we can see, hey, even though, folks are thinking of them as extinct at lower latitudes, they actually kind of following their little niche as further north as they could be until it kind of ran out, right? And so, yeah, that's probably the case that basically those early North American horses, a little bit more, adapted to the Ice Age conditions and didn't make it through to the modern era. But the success to which those introduced, Iberian horses have had speaks to the fact that much of the ecology in the landscape that we're living in now sort of evolved with horses as a key part of its community, right?
Hi, thank you. Um, Quick question. You were saying that a lot of our horses were either went to glue factories or weren't bred or whatever during the 1900s because we switched to the combustible engines and stuff. Um, Currently, it seems like the horse racetracks are disappearing and the places to go riding are getting smaller and more expensive because hay is expensive and so on. And I've always been a little sad because I kind of wonder, are we losing horses at a great rate? Or you said there's always seems to be a place for them. What would you predict in the future for the horses?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one to get a handle on. There are definitely some things that you could see as, like smaller scale racetracks or something in which you can probably see there's definitely a changing cultural relationship um, to the horse. Um, on the other hand, there are aspects of contemporary horse culture that are growing, right? Some of those ones that I've seen that are growing include, like I would say these, equine assisted therapy stuff is popping up more and more frequently. Um, I have noticed that it's different from area to area, right? So in Indian country, I would say there's a lot of efforts at like restoring traditional horse herds. There's almost like a rewilding situation going on in a lot of native nations, and folks are raising horses for that cultural connection piece and expanding rather than decreasing those programs. And so there's the element of urbanization. There's like, what are our cultural preferences as a group in the U.S.? What are cultural preferences in some corners? Like the agricultural industry, maybe it's on a still gentle slope down, but maybe some parts of the country it's not true. So I would say I do think we're entering a brave new world in which horses' role looks a lot different than it has been. Um, just as an example, though, how complicated that stuff can be. In Mongolia, I would say there's probably the same population of horses that there always has been. Now there's some really wild stuff happening. Folks bringing in like thoroughbreds and various English horses and whatever, and trying to crossbreed them in at a 25% ratio so that they'll still survive the winter but win the horse races, and they're kind of getting globalized, right? You know, and so it's stuff is complicated, it's complex, and I do think on a certain level, you know, if you look at, in my view, if you look at where are there wild horses in the U.S., it's not like the great horse habitats of the country. It's pretty much anywhere that there aren't people, right? And so there's that ecological footing of horses as an animal that likes and does well in the grasslands and a lot of different environments. So there's millions of horses in this country. Believe it or not, I think the number is like probably 7 million or something like that. There's millions of horses all over the world, and they're doing pretty well numerically. They're just changing in their relationships, and it's a little different in every corner of the globe. Long non-answer, but that's my thoughts.
All right, I just want to give folks a heads up. We're gonna go a bit over our time because I think we still got some questions to answer. So yeah, um, we have someone online who asks, "Is there evidence of when the diet of the domesticated horses transitioned from free range grass grazing to hays and grains?"
great question. Question that doesn't get asked often enough, to be honest. The truth of the matter, in my view, is that we so far have very little evidence that any sort of, you know, feeding, stabling, like sedentary type of horse situation was involved with the earliest domestication, which is why I view the transport piece was so important. Basically, early domestication settings, horses were essentially free ranging, right? In a way that you can still see and recognize in Mongolia today. It's not that they were uncontrolled, it's that they were not necessarily fenced, right? So they were a herd of horses that could be controlled by somebody who has horse transport, but might be off in their pasture on their own. Now, you know, it's not as crazy as it might sound. Horses are pretty territorial and stable. They like to kind of have their area. You know, they're probably kind of settled into the whole business. But the first horses that would have been fed and stabled and these kind of things would have been those first horses moving out of the steppes and into, you know, ancient Egypt, where you're going to put your horse, right? There would have been feeding them agricultural grains. Now, there's not actually very good science on the foddering of some of those earliest horses, but almost certainly would have been happening in places like, you know, China, ancient Egypt, some of these places where there just isn't the pasture to support a large herd of horses without other intervention.
So I see horses, the evolution with humans, as humans evolved, as war and work, but then there's also wonder. And so when I saw the burial, it might have been Egyptian, and I suppose when the person died, the horse was killed and put with them. And was there anything that we could speculate about relationships back then? Like, did they bond with the horses, or was that just like the saber was put there too?
So again, we recognizing that we only have a fraction of the kind of insights into these sorts of things that we would like to have. But what I can say is that we know from very, very early on that horses, when they were living with early pastoralists in the ancient steppes, for example, were receiving veterinary care. In fact, what among probably the world's oldest evidence for veterinary dentistry comes from the steppes of Mongolia, 1200 BC, and there were folks intervening in things like a tooth that came in the wrong way, right? So indicating a level of attention and care in a way that we can recognize by somebody who just looks at bones all day, right? We can see other things though too that point to deeper significance to relationships. And I would encourage you, if you ever have the chance, you know, to go to the steppes of Mongolia and go to visit some of these things you'll see highlighted in the book here, sites that we call deer stones associated with the first horse culture. They're these standing stones, you know, about the size of a person, each one sort of carved to represent a person. They're also often decorated. They're called deer stones because they often have these kind of like deer tattoos. They often decorated with little horses. In fact, I have one tattooed on my right arm here. Is like 4 horses riding towards like a sun or something, right? But each individual deer stone is surrounded by, you know, to mark that person's death or their memory. What might be a few dozen, or at one spot, it's actually 1,700 individual horses that were buried along with that person, and they're all oriented so their head is facing the rising sun, right? And like I said, often decorated with imagery that would indicate, you know, some role of, you know, maybe carrying these folks to the afterlife. That freedom, right, that you associate, or that connection, that joy, that it's almost like a spiritual connection embedded in, at least in a place like Mongolia, with the very first horse culture as deeply as you could recognize it anywhere from the Mongol Empire to the modern world, right? And so again, we can't recreate a conversation between a person and a horse. Sometimes we just see the things they left behind, but even the burials of horses themselves in places like Mongolia in the first millennium BC, elaborate headdresses, you know, these incredible, look up sometime Pazyryk, P-A-Z-Y-R-Y-K, the headdresses that a horse was buried with in the first millennium BC would put, you know, they're grander than any of the royal, you know, accoutrement of anywhere in Central Asia, right? They're incredible. So they do indicate things like veneration. They do indicate things like spiritual connection. You know, I'm often just nuts and bolts, show you the bones kind of a person, but they're very obviously pieces of that story that we don't know and things that we can just see little tantalizing snippets of.
Thanks very much. Two questions. Did I understand that you just say that the domesticated horses today around the world are all descended from those that were first domesticated north of the Black Sea?
Yeah, all of them. Yeah.
And then would it ever be possible to domesticate a zebra?
I'm glad you asked. It might not be too late to register for my Smithsonian talk on Wednesday, in which I will show some pictures about this. So believe it or not, one of the things that happened right before our whole mechanized era, sorry to say, I have so many slides, geez, was this very funny time in which the Western powers of the world were spending a lot of time in Africa. And I didn't talk about it too much here in this talk, but one of the challenges of horses that was pretty significant is that they don't do well in tropical environments, and especially very susceptible to insect-borne diseases in tropical environments. And Africa has this impenetrable wall of insect-borne disease by the environment of the tsetse fly, basically. You know, trypanosomiasis, African horse sickness, a bazillion different totally fatal diseases, right? And basically, you know, horses could kind of hang out in that sub-Saharan region, but as soon as you got to the jungle, they were done. And they would die very quickly. So in the stages of European colonization, this was a problem for European colonial powers that had infrastructure based mostly on horses, right? And so they would, you know, try to bring in their horses, they would die. And the United States involved in that too, right? We had colonial actions in Africa, and so there was a lot of brain power trying to solve this problem before it was easy to get a gasoline engine, right? And they actually experimentally tried to domesticate the zebra. And there was a hot minute where in the big cities around the world, you could actually see zebra carriages, but nobody was riding zebras around, right? And so this is kind of an instructive moment where you actually can see the reason for the chariot stuff, like the wilder animals behaviorally, a little more controllable if you slot them into that, you know, carriage or cart situation. But there's some funny narratives, and I wrote an article about this about 5 years ago. Google Dan the zebra; it'll be the first thing that comes up. So the king of Abyssinia gave some zebras to Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. And Teddy Roosevelt was like, we're going to domesticate the zebra. And he created this little national zoo breeding program or whatever. And he tasked some poor folks to all right, here you go, do this. And so they had this caretaker whose job it was to control the zebras. And Dan was one of the famous ones. You can see all these pictures of Dan in a bridle and whatever. But you see the caretaker, he's got an eye patch, he bit off his arm. And eventually they stopped trying to get Dan to behave, and they were trying to breed Dan with, they created a zonkey, a zorse, right? They were like, can we dilute the zebra out of him to the point where you got something that'll behave, right? Ultimately, it was I think 15 years of this stuff, and then they kind of abandoned it. But the reason I came across all this is I was looking through the skeletal collections of the Smithsonian, thinking, oh, I've got these great ideas for things that indicate domestic horses. and how they differ from wild animals. And I saw this zebra and I was heartbroken. I was like, oh no, I found these on a zebra, that my hypothesis is bunk. And then I looked at, and it says Dan the zebra, and I like Googled Dan the zebra, and I learned about this, 15 years of trying to make Dan the zebra be a, domestic animal. So fascinating insight into why the behavioral piece is so important in horse transport and equid transport. And the answer is probably no. I mean, if every animal could be functionally domestic, I mean, could you tame it and get on its back? Yes. And if you look hard enough, you'll see Teddy Roosevelt riding a zebra, right? That the stuff is out there. But there's a reason that we're not riding a moose, right? Other than the big horns. They're ornery, right? And there's a certain point in which the cost benefit ratio just, tilts the other way and we give up, right? So, yeah, funny story.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Going back to the bone density diagram that you had before, you said that it shows domestic use. Have you been able to date to about the same range that you found? I'm thinking about 2,000 years, you said, is about when domestication kind of fell into 2,500. Have you been able to see that in the bones of the animals from that time?
Yeah, so the tricky bit here is like this diagram here, it's all about the vertebrae. And the very, very oldest domestic horses are actually, I think I got a little schema of them here. They come from, oops, what happened? I exploded my own PowerPoint. They're actually just like these little head and hooves, right? So that specific line of evidence about, the detailed vertebrae, the first oldest assemblages we can look at from that date to about 1800 BC. So just a century or two past them, but that's then all of a sudden we can start to see these various skeletal indicators. And it's not just the vertebrae. We've got different indicators on the skull. Is in fact one of the best possible sources of information about an animal's life. You can see not just damage to the teeth from a mouthpiece, but one of the first lines of evidence we found is actually those old bridles were very simple, and the reins were connected to a noseband. That noseband was used to break the animal, and that, if you've ever pet a horse, you can actually feel sometimes there's suture on their bones here, right? Because it's just bone and skin. So that bridle sitting right there on the bone and skin, it actually leaves like a nice little groove, right? So we can see where the bridle sat on the bridge of the nose in some of those. We can see other things linked to heavy exertion, right? There are posture changes at the back of the neck here from that kind of an ossification of the ligament here where the neck attaches, that a little bit stronger in horses used for transport, right? Either because they're getting a little pulling on the head or because they have their head up high a bunch of times. We've got a whole host of different information. One thing I will say is that the Ukrainian war has been devastating for our ability to really understand these. We're getting the hook. A lot of the earliest assemblages, these techniques are so new that they haven't been used to answer the most important questions here about how these earliest assemblages would look like. But I would say my colleague Igor Checherskov, who's been a postdoctoral scholar at CU, was one of the first scholars to really do this stuff in Russia. And the oldest ones that they've looked at, they're finding a lot of these skeletal indicators. Yeah. All right. I think I will turn the floor over. We have some maybe closing announcements, but I just want to say thank you all so much for being such an engaged and thoughtful audience. If you're interested in talking more about this stuff, I'm happy to linger. Please, buy a book support your local bookstore here. But also the CU Museum is free and open to the public. And, most days I'm in there. I love when people drop in to say hi. I may not always be there. There's usually a student breathing down my neck somewhere. But, please stay connected and please come and see us. And one of these days soon, we'll have a cool new horse exhibit. So thanks so much for your time.
Right. Just a few quick thank yous and announcements. First of all, I want to thank you, Will, for making the trip up and for sharing all your amazing knowledge. I want to thank you all, the audience, for joining us and bringing your great questions. I want to thank our partner, McDonald Bookshop, for a couple things. First of all, for introducing me to Will at Bibliophile Night. So if you don't know about those, I'll put a link in an email I'm going to send to everyone who registered. You can sign up for McDonald's newsletter. Um, check out their bibliophile nights. They're really cool. It's like a more intimate encounter with great authors. Yeah, and I want to thank you all for partnering on tonight's talk. A quick note about upcoming programs. Will mentioned equine therapy on the 29th. We will have Hearts and Horses at the library. Uh, they're an equine they're an equine therapy group that works with folks with disabilities. So they'll be here to talk about their work and how horses can help people cope and heal. And they will bring Levi and Paco, their two miniature donkeys.
Oh.
That's going to be pretty cool. And then finally, Elizabeth Letts will be joining us at the library for talks on January 31st, February 1st. Register on our website. I will send an email with a survey about the event. Love it if you could fill that out. Let us know what you thought about this program. And I'll also include things mentioned here. I'll see if I can find out about your Smithsonian talk and put a link to that. Dan the Zebra for sure. And yeah, so we have 4 signed copies of Hoof Beats here. And I think, and then if they run out, you can always order one from McDonald. If folks want to do that and don't get a signed copy, I'll bring some book plates down and Will can sign a
Or
book plate if you
I will also promise, if anyone wants to get theirs through McDonald, I come through a lot. We'll be happy to come up and sign it, or you can bring it by the museum and just say hi, and I'll do that too. So.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.